and regions, maybe it should just be the nations? Just your view on that?
Well, you'll have to wait to find out what our very strong views are on that. But was our brilliant SNP MP Pete Whishart right about the news bias up in Scotland? Well, that's up to you, my friends north of the border. But on the 23rd of January 2023, in the Scottish Affairs Committee meeting, our Pete Whishart was asking the Minister of State for Media, Data and Digital Infrastructure, Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, Julia Lopez, quite a mouthful I will admit, about what he felt was less than satisfactory news media bias with the news up in Scotland. Oh, and there's a little treat for you at the end, so stick around and watch that, my friends.
Do you ever get concerned about satisfaction ratings for news in Scotland, where we seem to be below the rest of the UK for general satisfaction about the way the news is reported in our nation?
Well, I mean, I don't know, because it's a reserved area. I think I take a view that there are various different parts of the UK that feel like the gap between them and Westminster is too wide, and I think that's a problem that we have to seek to address, not with a sort of necessarily a Scotland-specific view, but how do we make sure that the BBC is more reflective of the nations it serves more generally, and I think that they're already taking steps to try and address that in the way in which they are.
They've always been taking steps to address it, but in the 22 years that I've been a Member of Parliament taking an interest in these issues, there's always been higher dissatisfaction with news coverage in Scotland than any other part of the UK in what you call the nations and regions. Do you not sort of feel that the Scottish people aren't really securing the type of news that they feel that they deserve?
Well, I mean, the Scottish consumption of BBC services is very high, and there are various issues that have been raised in relation to whether the BBC is adequately representing public debate in Scotland. But I mean, we've seen ways in which that is going to be addressed through the BBC's own actions, but also when there are issues about whether the BBC is reflecting stories accurately and so on, they are independently regulated by Ofcom and have taken action against the BBC in areas where they feel they haven't been adequately representing the Scottish debate.
I'll give you one example about how maybe this is reflected in Scotland, and it's about Brexit, about how Brexit is covered within the BBC particularly. There was an opinion poll done in the national newspaper that said that 53% of Scots were dissatisfied with the way that Brexit had been covered. Only 3% thought it was covered well, and I think 15% thought it was all right. Does that not sort of suggest that maybe Scotland isn't getting the type of news it requires, but something as big as Brexit is being covered in such a way that people actually don't find as reflective of their own opinion?
Well, I think, I represent a constituency in East London and the Essex border. I think that as a very pro-Leave voting area, my constituents might make the opposite case, that some of those views were not adequately reflected in the BBC's coverage. I'm simply making the point that there are different perceptions of the BBC according to different parts of the country, and I think that the BBC has to address those by trying to move staff out into different parts of the country to make sure that breadth of debate is out there, to make sure that programmes are made about different parts of the country that are reflective of those communities. It's not for me to sort of say, well, yes, those views are valid and those views aren't. We have an independent regulator. It's not for the minister to start determining who's not being satisfied with news production, who isn't. It's to try and set broad policies that allow that reflection and that diversity of viewpoint to come through.
Maybe the problem is it's always referred to, and I know there used to always be the Manchester Conference, Salford Conference in the nations and regions. Maybe it should just be the nations? Just your view on that?
I don't have a strong view on it, I'm afraid.
So yes, you don't have a strong opinion about it, I'm afraid. But I know for a fact that you guys do. So you guys in Scotland, let me know down below and tell me who's in the right, Pete Whishart or Julia Lopez. Now a little added treat for you, or maybe not. But a little delve into a Scottish Affairs Committee meeting won't be the same without our ridiculous Douglas Straw sticking his 2 penneth worth into it. He just couldn't help himself.
To follow up the Chair's point, maybe there's lots of complaints about the BBC in Scotland for their perceived bias in favour of the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon. I certainly get a lot of complaints about their coverage with that, to the extent that the BBC had put out a statement just last week, I think it was, when one of their reporters interviewing the Prime Minister called Nicola Sturgeon our leader, forgetting clearly that Scotland has two governments and a Prime Minister and a First Minister. So maybe, Chair, that's where a lot of the complaints are coming from.
Oh yes, what do you guys think about that then, my friends? Let me know down below, and I shall bid you farewell and take care, my friends.